A new era has been entered in the war with Russia, which took place on the territory of Ukraine and completed 1 year. The Russians are preparing to evacuate the Crimea. Attacks and sabotage by the Ukrainian army on targets in Crimea have increased. The fate of Crimea, which has a strategic importance for Russia, was a matter of curiosity. In fact, we can say that the fate of this war will be determined by the Crimea. The Ukrainian army has started the countdown for the Crimean Peninsula, one of the most important strategic points on the Black Sea. One of the main objectives of the armed forces of Ukraine is the evacuation of civilians from Crimea after the attacks, because in this way, they will be able to act more comfortably against the Russian army in their attacks. The sensitivity of the Kherson counterattack had cost them a great deal of time, but no matter what, Vladimir Putin continues to mobilize his army to protect the region. It is estimated that there are between 40,000 and 70,000 Russian troops in the Crimea. The attacks caused a psychological collapse while disturbing the Russian soldiers in many ways. During this process, Russian officers sent their families from Crimea to Russia. While the effects of the attacks on the Russian soldiers were in this direction, the effect on the Russian people in the Russian Crimea was much more severe. Until August, more than 1.5 million Russian citizens lived in Crimea. But now that the Russian military assets in the Crimea have been subjected to 7 months of attacks, the Russians neither tried to flee to Russia in panic, anxiety, fear, and turmoil. It is now thought that in the past 7 months and now about 20% of Russians in Crimea, around 300,000 Russians have fled to Russia. 2.5 million people live in Crimea. Russians are the ethnic group with the highest density of 60%. However, as it can be understood, from here it is seen that approximately 300,000 Russians left Crimea. Even ethnic Russians who are residents of Crimea from time to time, that is, those who resided before 2014, migrate by selling their 70 to 80-year-old houses and lands. The Russians reportedly moved from Crimea to the neighboring Russian region, fearing that Ukraine would eventually liberate the Black Sea Peninsula. It is said that many Russian citizens who settled in Crimea, which was occupied 8 years ago, have already left the region. On the other hand, the Russian occupying authorities in Crimea are selling their properties and taking their families away. It has been learned that the Russian command and Moscow's deputies established in Crimea have begun to evacuate from the occupied peninsula, sell their real estate, and take their families away. It is claimed that the people of Crimea heard a warning on radio stations the previous day to prepare to leave Crimea, and that the announcement was aimed at those who cooperated with the Russian occupying authorities. That's why everyone working for Russia is told to leave the Crimea region of Ukraine as soon as possible. Information came that the local occupiers or the occupying authorities were placed in the Krasnodar region of Russia, which they are currently renting. That is, the trend leads to the conclusion that the armed forces of Ukraine creates panic and fear that in the near future it will be able to liberate Crimea until Kiev retakes Crimea. It will not stop fighting, and the battleground will determine the fate of the Russia-Ukraine war will be Crimea. Ukrainian army arrives for Crimea with advanced Western-made weapons. Now what Russia fears is about to happen. We can say that Ukraine is now very close to taking back Crimea. Ukraine is preparing to attack Crimea. There are now strong signals that the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing for the Crimean offensive. A new offensive force is being created for Ukraine at Kher level with Western support. In the spring, Ukraine will launch a counterattack and support will be entirely from NATO. Western Ukraine is sending approximately 500 and third-generation main battle tanks to its armed forces for use on both the Eastern and Crimean fronts. Leopard 2 tanks from Poland and Canada have already reached the Ukrainian front. Also, the US has signaled that it will support Ukraine's Crimean offensive, and the Ukrainian armed forces are providing 150 km range ammunition. In fact, Nowadays, Russia needs to decide well what kind of measures it should take in order for a dynamic battle that will develop in the field to show tactical targets and directions in favor of Ukraine. The friction between the Wagner warriors fighting on the front lines and the Russian army makes the Kremlin think because Crimea is about to be lost. Although 2022 was a tragic year for Ukraine, it was also a year of historical achievements. Russia invaded Ukraine and killed tens of thousands of people, but within a few weeks, the Ukrainian army was able to stop the attacks. Then they began to force the Russians to retreat. Since August, the Ukrainian army has thwarted Moscow's dreams of victory by reclaiming more than half of the territory captured by Russia. The Russian army, which lost power day by day, lost the lands it captured one by one and suffered an unprecedented defeat in its history. Now it's Crimea's turn. Russia took over the peninsula in 2014 seriously, violating international law. Although the Western states were unanimous that the annexation of Crimea was unacceptable, they could not get Crimea back to Ukraine. However, the situation changed with the invasion movement launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin to Ukraine. It turned out that Russia's possession of Crimea is not only a security risk for Ukraine, but Moscow's holding of the peninsula is also putting the whole world in danger. Although it is not easy to take back Crimea, Ukraine has the ability to do so. Ukrainian forces are ready to move towards the peninsula, and Russian military capabilities are severely frayed. Russia's remaining soldiers are exhausted and do not want to fight. On the other hand, the country's advanced missile stocks are at the level of exhaustion. Naval bases, air bases, and supply routes to Crimea were damaged by Ukrainian attacks. In short, in the face of a possible attack on Crimea, Russia is not in a position to stand against the Ukrainian army, which is supported by the USA and NATO allies. With the sending of more advanced Western-made weapons to support the Ukrainian forces, Russia has begun to increase its security measures against the Crimea. Against the expected major Ukrainian offensive in spring, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is openly fearing the invasion of Crimea. On the other hand, it turned out that the Ukraine has missiles in its arsenal that can reach Sevastopol. After the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed that Ukraine has Grom-2 tactical missile systems and missiles, it became known that the complexes have been in Ukraine since 2022. However, for a year, Kiev managed to establish the production of tactical missiles on the territory of neighboring Poland. And given the fact today the armed forces of Ukraine has 2 launchers, this is an extremely serious threat to Russia. The exact number of missiles in service with the armed forces of Ukraine is still unknown. But given the start of their production, Ukraine is likely to receive a fairly large number of tactical missiles with a maximum hit range of 280 kilometers. In this direction, the Russians began to flee from Crimea amid fears that Ukraine would advance. Russians are fleeing Crimea, fearing that Ukraine will soon take action to recapture the area that Vladimir Putin illegally annexed in 2014. In a speech, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky promised to retake Crimea, saying that Ukrainian army has maintained its goal of recapturing Crimea since its annexation. Zelensky mentioned that this war, which started with the invasion of Crimea, with Russia's attempt to seize Donbass, will end there in the liberated Crimea, in the liberated Donbass cities. When the troops reach the state border of Ukraine, it is certain that Ukraine will continue to fight until the peninsula is forcibly taken from Moscow. In addition, Zelensky warned that Russian troops to either flee or surrender if they wanted to survive, stating that the Russian army does not and will not have a single safe base, a single quiet place in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine from the Crimea to the Kharkiv region. Zelensky urged the Russian soldiers to surrender for their own lives. Ukrainian leader Zelensky stated that the invaders will destroy all their warehouses, headquarters, equipment, wherever they are. This is Ukrainian soil, and the invaders can only do 2 things: flee or surrender. "We are not leaving them any other choice," he said. The permanent end of Russian aggression and the liberation of Crimea also set an important historical precedent for the whole world. In other words, we can say that recapturing Crimea is vital to prevent future conflicts and to prevent a return to a period of conquests. In the Bakhmut area, the Russians made a local breakthrough. Here the Russians launched a massive attack on the Ukrainian positions on the hills and, according to many sources, breached the Ukrainian defenses, expanded control over the region, and got closer to completing the operational encirclement of Bakhmut. However, today's geolocated footage from the battlefield showed that in reality, the Russians did not get that far. Last time we discussed this region, I told you that the Russians in Blahodatan were very limited in their immediate options of advance towards Palisivka because there are a lot of natural and artificial barriers in the region. I also told you that moving around these barriers by expanding westward is extremely problematic because they would be going uphill, exposing themselves excessively. Under normal circumstances, the Russians would continue the slow, incremental movement, avoiding risky tactics. But current circumstances are not normal. As you know, the Russians need to collapse the Ukrainian defense somewhere in order to force the Ukrainians to use up their reserves, which would create perfect conditions for launching their offensive operation. One of the options is to collapse the Bakhmut front, and since they are running out of time, the Russian command ordered them to push as intensely as possible. As a result, Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians here ran away because they had no ammunition and couldn't fire back. However, in reality, the Russians conducted a very costly move and assaulted Ukrainian positions on the local heights from all sides. Ukrainian forces were overwhelmed. The Russians started cutting them off from the mainland, which is why the Ukrainians made a decision to retreat. The Russians inevitably suffered huge losses because they were attacking trenches on the empty hills. So the only way they could prevent questioning the soundness of this order was by claiming that the Ukrainians had no bullets to inflict any losses on them. In any case, the bottom line is Russians conducted a necessary operation and it was successful. By clearing this hill, the Russians opened a window for advancing in the valley towards the highway, in particular towards the Lysyansky, Ryhovo, Vasilivka and Dubova-Vasilivka. As reported by the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian sources once again took the opportunity to conduct an information operation and claim that the Russians' rapidly expanded control over the region are fighting inside all of these villages and encircled Paraskovia. However, in the direction of these villages doesn't mean inside these villages. Today, geolocated footage was published showing a Russian tank firing at Ukrainian positions near Dubova-Vasilyevka. This Russian tank was located precisely on this intersection of three belts. Even though the Russians have breached one Ukrainian positions on the local heights, this did not give them a meaningful tactical advantage because all other Ukrainian positions are also on the hills. In fact, Ukrainian positions near the Lysyansky and Dubova-Vasilivka are 10 to 30 meters higher. On top of that, assaulting them requires the Russians to go back in the lowlands before they can once again storm the hills. Overall, the Russians took control of an important Ukrainian positions and set conditions for increasing the intensity of their attacks on Paraskeva by attacking it from the north. Nonetheless, it did not lead to the immediate encirclement of Paraskeva or rapid westward expansion. Russian forces are visually confirmed to be 2.5 kilometers away from the highway or 6 kilometers away from Morhovo-Vasilyevka. Due to the local geography, it will not be easy to close this distance when it comes to Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are still holding it while slowly withdrawing their forces. Some sources indicate that there are no more than 10,000 soldiers left in Bakhmut. Other sources indicate that the Ukrainians already withdrew from the meat processing plant, so almost all forces are already on the western side of the river and ready to leave Bakhmut when necessary. The main goal was to hold it at least by the end of this week without engaging reserves, because this is when the Russians have to start their massive offensive operation, and when it comes to their offensive operation. Today, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the Russians heavily shelled absolutely all settlements in the northern part of the Luhansk region. Such extensive artillery preparation means that the Russians have no time left to wait and will launch their offensive operation in a few days. The Ukrainians are fully ready for this attack because they saved all of their reserves by ensuring that the Russians do not collapse. Bakhmut, Siversk, Avdiivka, Volodar. The breaking point of the war between Russia and Ukraine has become a major concern for the Kremlin. Ukraine's path to victory passes through the Pearl of the Black Sea, Crimea. Crimea is a key and has a decisive role in this war. Ukraine wants to open its doors to freedom using the Crimean key. Crimea was once a great strategic advantage for the Russian army and its strongest trump card for Black Sea domination. But now the city is becoming a major weak spot and black hole where the Russian army panicked fortifications, strengthened its defense and troop concentration, and succumbed to Ukrainian attacks. At the moment, we see that the capacity of the Ukrainian army to threaten Crimea has increased tremendously, that it keeps the land corridor between Kherson and Crimea under control and can create an atmosphere of great anxiety and panic in Crimea. So how do the Ukrainian armed forces achieve this? Ukrainian forces strive to liberate Crimea first, making it vulnerable to the Russian army, navy, and air force on the peninsula. In this context, Ukrainian forces accelerated their long-range attacks against many Russian military elements in the depths of Crimea. For this purpose, Ukraine is organizing many attacks on Russian positions in Crimea. The last of these was deployed to the second-largest Russian military airbase in the Crimea. So how did the Ukrainian attacks reach the Russian military airbase 240 kilometers from the front line in Crimea? Unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to Ukraine managed to frighten Vladimir Putin by making a show of strength in the skies of Crimea. The last of these attacks occurred around 4:20 p.m. local time in the airbase area in Gaverdysk in Crimea, which was temporarily occupied by Russia last day. A mysterious Ukrainian weapon struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local residents reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gaverdysk in Simferopol district. According to local reports, the first few explosions were heard. Then black smoke appeared above the airbase. According to the claims of Russian officials, Russian air defense systems hit the unmanned aerial vehicle. In addition, a large crater was allegedly found at the scene. The diameter of the crater is about 10 to 12 meters and the depth is about 3.5 meters. The military air base in the village of Gaverdysk received another incurable wound with the attacks by the mysterious vehicles of Ukraine. It is likely that the heroes which carried out this attack were bomb-laden drones when bombs dropped from the drones hitting the military airbase. Huge explosions occurred in the skies of Crimea, surrendered to the dark clouds. The Russian authorities have not yet made a statement regarding the casualties resulting from the attack. However, considering the ammunition and soldiers at the airbase, it is a strong possibility that there will be serious casualties. Together with this, it was not specified from which direction the drone flew. Given that the aircraft has successfully covered such a long distance from both the borders of Ukraine and over the territory of Russia, Ukraine is taking direct steps towards Crimea and is marching to victory step by step with the support of Western countries. So what is needed for Ukraine to save Crimea? And at what stage is Ukraine currently in its offensive against Crimea? First of all, liberating Crimea is a really difficult challenge for the Ukrainian army. There is much to be done and the Ukrainians need all kinds of strategies and weapons for this. Kherson and Melitopol should be cut off from Crimea. The Crimean land corridor should be completely controlled and the Russian ammunition and troop shipments over the Kerch Bridge should be stopped. The Russian army is not currently in an advantageous position in Crimea, but it can reinforce its troops in Crimea over Melitopol in the Melitopol and Kerch bridges. To avoid these scenarios, the armed forces of Ukraine needs long-range, menacing weapons and a strong army of tanks and UAVs. Ukrainian forces need some special equipment to carry out an attack from their current positions to the depths of the Crimea. These equipment include ATACMS with a range of 300 kilometers, small-scale bombs launched from the ground with a range of 150 kilometers, Grey Eagle drones that can stay in the air for 25 hours, and third-generation NATO-class heavy battle tanks. Ukrainian drones cause serious concerns for Russian officials. The determined stance of the Kiev administration on Crimea is fueling a series of cross-border operations. In addition to the Gverdiysk attack, Sevastopol and Bakhchisaroy near Yalta hosted explosions in Bakhchisaroy, the engineering warehouse of the military unit of the 758th Logistics Center of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet, and the warehouse of the 133rd Brigade of the MTO were located. An explosion occurred near a Russian military unit in Bakhchisaroy in Crimea the other day. Along with this explosion, voices were heard in Yalta, Gurzov, and other settlements located along the coastline in the southwestern part of Crimea. In Bakhchisaroy, on Simferopolsky Street, an explosion occurred in the area of an important military unit for the Russian forces. The explosion was so strong that residents of many villages in Bakhchisaroy region were startled by the sound of the explosion. There are testimonies of residents in the region that there were also explosions on the southern coast of Crimea in Yalta, Gurzov, and other settlements. Local residents stated that everything was in pieces at the same time. Many aircraft sounds were heard in the area. The point where the explosions took place is located between the two largest cities of the Crimea region, Sevastopol and Simferopol. In these two cities, there are large military establishments for the Russian army in Crimea. So will Ukraine be able to take back Crimea? Over the past weeks, the US, initially skeptical of Ukraine's ability to retake Crimea, said that Kiev might have the capacity to take the peninsula. Washington has warmed to the idea of helping Ukraine in this effort, now that NATO members plan to supply Ukraine with modern weapons such as tanks and jets. The ZSU can use combined arms operations in the remainder of the occupied territories. Defense officials told the Zelensky administration that instead of sending new weapons to Bakhmut, he should withdraw to more established defensive lines in the Donbas region because the situation in that area remains critical and the city is not as strategic as Russia claims. Instead, they told Kiev to prepare plans for a southern offensive, with the most likely target being the ever-important city of Melitopol, as the attack on Melitopol would put much of Crimea within range of the HIMARS and other long-range rocket systems that both the UK and the US have confirmed to send later in the year. Liberating Melitopol would also challenge the Kremlin's invasion plans, as it would divide Russian forces from the south and east, forcing Putin to either retain what his forces control in the Donbas region or prioritize protecting Crimea. If Kiev can successfully recover the territory in Zaporizhia, they can use the shortening of their operational area to their advantage. A smaller area of operation means a greater concentration of Russian forces, and this allows for more successful offensives in the Crimea, as seen in the concentration of the Russian garrison by the Ukrainian army during its offensive in Kherson. Since the attacks in Crimea, Russia's precious Black Sea Fleet has made fewer trips to Ukraine's coastline. This indicates that the attacks have strained the Russian fleet and are unlikely to provide air support to Russian forces in the south, especially after the loss of large numbers of fixed-wing aircraft in the Crimea. Kiev's strategy so far in this war includes attrition operations on supply lines, fuel and ammo depots, and command and control points. A southern offensive that could put the Ukrainian army within range of the Crimea would enable more of these operations on the peninsula. Pressure on the Crimea could put the garrisoned Russian forces in a dangerous position. They may try to face the peninsula without adequate resupply and being bombarded almost daily, or they may retreat of their own accord. The war in Ukraine began with the occupation and annexation of Crimea and will have to end with the liberation of the peninsula. Moscow uses the unsinkable aircraft carrier as the main preparation point for its operations against Kiev, so the country will never be safe until the Russian forces are expelled from the Crimean Peninsula. In the future, we'll see the lock of the war broken in the Crimea. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.